Hello everyone, it's Thursday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. The leaders of NATO countries will gather in Lithuania on July 11th and 12th for their annual summit. President Yoon Suk Yeol too has been invited to attend the gathering of the U.S. and its European allies for the second time, following his appearance in Spain last year. Other Asia-Pacific partners are invited as well: Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. Amid speculation that a four-party meeting is going to be held among the AP4, along with the possibility of a trilateral meeting between Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo, eyes are on what topics are going to be discussed. For an in-depth analysis, we invite into the studio Professor Mason Richey from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Professor Richey, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And we also have Professor Chung Ku-youn from Kangwon National University. Professor Chung, good to see you.
Good to see you too.
All right, first question to our Professor Chung. Now, President Yoon is going to attend a NATO meeting in Lithuania. Now, what significance does this have, and what is President Yoon Suk Yeol expected to bring to the table?
Well, indeed, this is the second time South Korea attended NATO Summit as an observer. The main theme of this summit is actually deepened support for Ukraine in its fight against Russia, while invigorating national militaries to sharpen its own deterrence of Moscow. So Ukraine is demanding two things at the summit: much heavier weapon, and concrete NATO's commitment to Ukraine's future membership that goes beyond the established vow that the country will one day be admitted to the alliances. Another issue is about tensions over military spending. The war already has shows that limited ability of non-NATO U.S. NATO nations to wage a large-scale conflict. So many are starting from the position that low spending that have long concerned American policymakers. So especially since the Donald Trump. So all of this issue will be the main theme, but at the same time, South Korea will have a lot of topics to engage. First of all, there will be a discussion on North Korea and South Korea's attempting to garner support for its North Korea policy for denuclearizations, and discussion on cooperating on NATO in the Pacific, and new security threats such as cyber. So all of these discussions will be a great exposure for South Korea to understand the current dynamics and find the opportunity to scale up is our contribution.
Right, I see. Well, those are the topics that we can expect to be discussed. Now, Professor Richey, not just South Korea, leaders of NATO's other Asia-Pacific partners like Australia, New Zealand, and Japan are going to attend the summit as well. And according to Japan's Yomiuri Shimbun, a four-party summit is going to be coordinated. What issues need to be dealt with?
Yeah, so in the first place, all four of these countries, both individually and in this sort of inchoate capacity as the AP4 that we call them, will follow one from the foreign ministers meeting at NATO earlier this year to prepare, for the summit. And so, to some degree, the discussions are naturally going to follow from the meeting earlier this year. And so, obviously, the Russia-Ukraine war will be on the agenda. General discussion about the state of international order and international stability, the role of China in the South China Sea, in the Indo-Pacific more generally, but also, of course, increasingly in the Middle East, in Africa, the role that China plays in a very inchoate fashion in the Atlantic Basin. And of course, North Korea and weapons of mass destruction. That will all be on the table in a sort of general NATO context. Just within the context of the AP4, obviously those areas will be discussed among those countries. And you'll also see, I think, those countries have a discussion among themselves about where this AP4 is going. What are the bandwidth constraints that these countries have? What are the things that they're interested in contributing? What is it that they can get out of NATO? What are the risks and what are the positives? So this is an emerging dynamic, and so part of what's going on right now is simply going to be discussing that. There's a second thing, I think, which is going to be on the agenda, and that's the fact that the NATO is going to be putting together what they call individually tailored partnerships with each of these for AP4 member states, and this is going to represent an upgrading of the relationship. And so there'll be some coordination among those countries also about what it is that their individually tailored relationship with NATO is supposed to look like. And then, of course, the other thing I think that's
Right.
going to be on the agenda, and I think we're going to perhaps come to this a little bit later, is the possibility of opening up a liaison office for NATO in Tokyo. And that's a little bit uncertain, both whether or not it happens at all and also in terms of what the timing will be. So I think all of those things are going to be on the agenda. And South Korea, will have a lot to digest, I think, coming out of this meeting at the end of it.
Right, we are going to tap on NATO's plan to, deepen its collaboration with these Asia-Pacific region countries. But before that, Professor Chung, there is also speculation that another trilateral summit between South Korea, Japan, and the United States could take place on the sidelines of the NATO summit. What is the possibility, and if it does, what topics could be covered?
Well, it is possible, but given that ROC U.S.-Japan Trilateral Summit is supposed to be held in August, it is less likely we observe official, like a longer kind of trilateral summit in Lithuania this time. But if it does, I think three countries will address the policy of jointly responding to North Korea's recent launch of reconnaissance satellite and nuclear missile development, and also as well as a regional security landscape such as regional hotspot, as well as recently briefed de-risking policy of the United States and how these policies can be actually integrated into two countries' economic security policies. But again, I think it is less likely to see a trilateral summit at this time.
All right, so trilateral summit, that's less likely. But Professor Chung, just yesterday, Japanese media outlets reported that Japan and South Korea are arranging a bilateral summit to be held on the sidelines of a two-day high-level NATO meeting as well. What meaning would this summit have?
If it occurs, I think the main theme would be the recent release of the Fukushima radioactive water into the oceans. Probably Prime Minister Kishida will, by himself, explain this issue to President Yoon and how it is consistent with the international safety standard. In spite of the very recent publication of IAEA report, it seems that Prime Minister is concerned about the public opinion in South Korea as well as other regional countries. I think he think that he cannot ignore the strong negative sentiment and public opinion in those countries to be more persuasive about this behavior of Japan.
Right, I see your point. Now, Professor Richey, let's talk about NATO's plan to deepen its collaboration with four major Asia-Pacific partners. Before we delve into the specifics, why is it doing so?
I think the primary reason is that NATO members, also NATO as an institution, but also increasingly the states here in the Indo-Pacific, the ones that we now call the AP4, New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, and Japan, have realized that the threats that are present in the security environment today are cross-regional and in some cases even global, and that it's no longer really possible to fully separate the security dynamics of the Indo-Pacific from the North Atlantic area, or the Euro-Atlantic area, as we sometimes call it. And so that applies in the first place, even with something that seemingly is relatively regional, like the war in Ukraine. Russia's war of aggression there has impacted the area here. South Korea has been an increasingly important player in terms of the weapons that it's helped to supply to backfill countries that have been directly supplying Ukraine with weapons. Obviously, U.S. allies in the region have been asked to support with non-lethal aid and financial aid. They're an important part of the overall diplomatic pushback against Russia's war in Ukraine. So, there's already an area in which we see some overlap. Beyond that, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we have China, which is increasingly active not only in the Indo-Pacific region, but also in the Middle East and in Africa, and perhaps beginning now to even dip its toe into the water in the Atlantic basin as well. So there's a cross-regional dynamic there that affects security. We also have, obviously, for lack of a better term, global security threats such as climate change and cybersecurity, which are also increasingly a part of the NATO agenda. And I think if you take all of these sort of direct security-related issues, and then you put that within even a larger framework of emerging defense technology, notably things like artificial intelligence and robotics, and how important countries like Japan and South Korea are for the development of those technologies that are inputs into the defense technology that's important for NATO, it makes sense really for NATO and the Western European and North Atlantic states to want to be more involved with these AP4 countries. It's a little bit less obvious what the AP4 countries are supposed to get out of it, at least right in the short term. But I think that they're looking at it as a sort of long-term investment in order building rather than a short-term transactional advantage that they're supposed to get from it.
I see. It definitely seems like there are many overlapping areas and sectors that NATO and the Asia-Pacific partners could collaborate. I see. Now, Professor Chung, as part of this plan to strengthen ties, NATO is preparing for an individually tailored partnership program with all four, like our Professor Richey already talked about. Now, what was the previous partnership like, and what difference would this ITPP deal make for the four countries?
Well, for South Korea in 2012, South Korea and NATO signed the individual partnership and cooperation program. It is IPC.
All right. It seems like we are having a little bit of a technical glitches with Professor Chung's Skype right now. So why don't we first ask our Professor Richey about the next question and then come back to our Professor Chung when she comes back. So
Sure.
Professor Richey, as you have already mentioned, another plan was to open the NATO Liaison office in Tokyo next year, but the idea is reportedly facing opposition from France. Why is this so?
Yeah, so France seems to believe that this is perhaps a bit too confrontational vis-a-vis Beijing, and that opening up this liaison office in Tokyo will provoke or be one more input that feeds into a provocation cycle, where China is going to feel increasingly threatened and will respond in ways that are potentially destabilizing. So that's on the one hand, and of course business interests play a role in this too. I mean, France does have business interests in China. I think it's solicitous of those. It takes in many respects a less aggressive posture towards China than perhaps the U.S. does. There's a second, I think, thought, which is, and this is perhaps legitimate, and I think there's some real discussion here. What is the value added of this liaison office? Symbolically, of course, it's very important, but there is already an office that is responsible for dealing with these AP4 countries and their relationship with NATO. That's in the Danish embassy, and that office is currently staffed, with 4 people who are responsible for handling these relationships with these global partners in the Asia-Pacific region. And there is, I think, a pretty decent, question to ask whether or not there's going to be value added by opening up the liaison office beyond simply the symbolic value. What seems to be a likely possibility is that the NATO institution, which would like to see this liaison opened office, might try to sell to France, to the AP4 countries, and in some ways also to China, this office in Tokyo as an office that will be primarily responsible for rolling out these individually tailored partnership programs. And that might be a way of sort of sugarcoating the first sort of role that officially NATO would have in the region. And so whether or not that comes to fruition or not, I think is an interesting question that we don't know the answer to yet. But that will be something I think that's going to be discussed in and around the summit coming up in Lithuania.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Richey, since we have talked about this, China's concerns, I'd like to delve a little bit deeper into this. Recently, Wang Yi made remarks that urged Seoul and Tokyo to foster the strategic autonomy against the West. And this comment resonated quite much more in that it was made just a week before this upcoming NATO summit that both Japan and South Korea are taking part in. Now, what are China's concerns over this Asian version NATO?
So I think, in the big picture, China wants to avoid at all costs the construction of a multilateral security architecture like NATO, a sort of Asian NATO, that is, ultimately in some ways led by the United States. This is a geopolitical nightmare for Beijing. It wants to avoid this at all costs, and it will use all of its leverage that it has, in economics and in geopolitics, in diplomacy and security. It will use all of its cards to try to avoid this. Right now, it's largely at the stage of rhetoric. Now that's a long-term prospect, and I don't really think anyone believes that we're looking, in even the short to medium term, some type of, true, construction of an Asian NATO. I mean, Japan and South Korea still have enormous differences. New Zealand, just to give you one example, has some extreme bandwidth constraints on its diplomacy and on its defense. Australia, is not geographically located next to Japan or South Korea, so there are some real questions about, how this would emerge. But China's ultimate fear is that it ends up being encircled by this type of security, multilateral security architecture. In the short term, I think what it fears is that this type of growth of multilateral cooperation, the networking of U.S. Alliance partners, especially to some degree, that there's some spillover coming from NATO and into the organizing here, could lead to China's strategic assets here being degraded. For instance, its nuclear weapons, its missile systems, many of its military assets might be less valuable if the U.S. And its allies are working together. In a sense, China's strategic assets would therefore either have to be upgraded, which would be extremely costly to China,
right.
or in some sense, China would have to make accommodation to not becoming the primary power in the Indo-Asia Pacific, which is what it wants. And so, it finds itself in a very difficult position, I think, if this type of multilateral cooperation emerges.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Chung, welcome back. You must have been very surprised. Now, Professor Chung, up until now, we have been talking about NATO, but ASEAN Regional Forum is also due to take place in Indonesia. And is it possible that foreign ministers from South Korea and China could have a bilateral meeting and discuss ways to, improve relations?
Well, I think I remember that Foreign Minister Park Jin recently mentions that there will be a natural opportunity for both countries to meet. And South Korean government hopes that we can continue and develop friendly relations, even though we have difference of opinions. And I heard that South Korea and China recently resumed high-level dialogue after a period of very unusual conflict due to Taiwan issue, as well as Chinese Ambassador Xing Haiming's remarks on betting on China or betting on United States. So this recent high-level dialogue mainly addresses on Taiwan issue. And I've heard that South Korea emphasized that our position of respect for one China has been maintained unchanged since the establishment of our diplomatic relationship with China. So two sides, I've heard that agreed that negotiations were constructive enough and decided to continue our dialogue. Diplomatic communication between two countries. So should be, I think this should be the kind of directions that two countries to develop, even though there is a conflict on issues such as with differing opinion, whether it is possible to avoid escalating conflict through communication and create relationship that maintain mutual benefit is very important, given that the deeply interdependent economy as well as territorial integrity.
Right, I cannot agree more. Now, Professor Chung, since we are talking about ARF, I'd like to ask you this question as well. The ARF is also one of the few multilateral forums that has Pyongyang as a member. Now, before I ask about the possibility of Pyongyang's own foreign minister attending, why is the North involved in this forum?
ARF is a multilateral security consultative body joined by 27 regional countries, including 10 ASEAN countries, North and South Korea and the United States, China, Japan, Russia. So basically all Asian countries are there. And this is actually one of the few kind of multilateral security body where two Koreas can get together and discuss our issue. And it was actually 2000, the first year of North Korea's accession to ALF, when South Korea's foreign minister and North Korea's minister get together and hold an inter-Korean dialogue for the first time since division. So it's a kind of quite important platform where two countries actually discuss their issues together. And Indonesia actually shared this understanding that it is very important for two Koreas get together actually and discuss about nuclear and other inter-Korean issues. So Indonesia actually showed their kind of incentive and willingness to persuade North Korea to join this time. And I think given that they are just beginning to opening their kind of territory after coronavirus pandemic, so it is likely that Choi Sun-yi will participate in this ASEAN Regional Security Dialogue held in this summer. And I think given that possibility, then we're going to be prepared for how we can engage North Korea and start the dialogue in the first place.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Richey, that being said, our Professor Chung says there is high possibility that North Korea's top diplomat could attend this ARF talks. What are your views?
To be honest with you, I have a little bit of a different view, but I don't have any specific inside intel to back it up. So I'm only working sort of deductively. As Professor Chung mentioned, Foreign Minister Pak did talk about the natural possibility of meeting his Chinese counterpart at the ARF meeting. But only mentioned the possibility of meeting Jae Sun-mi, the North Korean foreign minister, through the sort of boilerplate restatement of, we're willing to meet more or less any time to talk about anything. And during the preparatory meeting in June, North Korea was represented by An Kwang-il, the ambassador to Indonesia, and there didn't seem to be any sense that North Korea was planning on sending someone else. The last time that North Korea sent a foreign minister to the ARF meeting was in 2018. Now, of course, part of the time, COVID was taking place, and that made it more difficult for North Korea to send the foreign minister. But it doesn't seem to me that North Korea has necessarily come fully out of the woods yet on COVID, even though perhaps we've seen some mention of the fact that the mask mandates have been taken away, and there's at least some talk about an increase in the borders being open, but that seems to be primarily for cargo and not so much for people. So I still would be relatively surprised if we would see her there this year, but that's just me, and it's entirely possible that I'm wrong. So perhaps if I'm wrong, I'll have to buy Dr. Chung a drink sometime.
All right. Unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Richey. And thank you, Professor Chung, for your insights and, of course, for being successfully reconnected. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.